Good evening. Welcome to Handwritten Art, Calligraphy in Asian and Islamic Cultures. I'm Adriana Proser, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Quincy Scott, Curator of Asian Art at the Walters Art Museum. And we're here tonight to talk to you about calligraphy. You may not notice or be aware when walking through Western galleries at museums, but calligraphy is in fact one of the world's most beautiful, dynamic, and powerful artistic expressions. In both East Asian and Islamic culture, the art of writing holds an exceptionally venerable and vibrant place. Today, Dany Chan, Assistant Curator of Asian Art, Ashley Dimmig, Wieler-Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow in Islamic Art at the Walters, and I will share with you a selection of calligraphy on paper and parchment, and also on painting, woodblock prints, ceramic, and other items from the Walters Art Museum. We'll be joined by Allison Gulick, Community Programs Coordinator, who will grab your questions at the end of the program. Feel free to submit questions in the chat throughout the program. We have a lot to cover, so let's jump right in.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Ani. So yes, let us dig into the main question that's on all of our minds. So all three of us, we make the claim that calligraphy is considered the highest art form in East Asian and Islamic cultures. Ani, can you start us off and give us a sense of why is that? Why is calligraphy considered an important artwork?
Sure. I want to just start by saying a little bit about the origins of calligraphy in China. And I'm starting to talk about China specifically because in East Asia, Chinese language was actually the first written language, not only for the Chinese, but also for Japanese and Koreans. So the calligraphic traditions in those countries are also tied to the Chinese tradition. And within Chinese mythology, there are sources that tie the origins of writing to the sage Sangjie, who is said to have discovered writing in images, like the tracks made by birds and animals in nature. But the earliest examples of characters that survive are actually on what are called oracle bones. These are bones from, for example, oxen, the back scapula of oxen, or turtle shells that were used by shamans to predict what would happen in the future. They would put them into fires and they would crack, and then they would read those cracks. And the questions were inscribed onto those bones. These date back as far as 1200 BCE. So it's a very, very long tradition of writing. But it wasn't really until around 1,000 years later that there was an important shift in the Chinese in the Chinese world, and that was this important shift where a Confucian government bureaucracy was formed, and an examination system was established to fill all of these government positions. And the exams tested candidates' ability to write in various script forms. So calligraphic skill actually became associated with classical knowledge, and it became a common belief that a person's writing actually could reflect their character, their moral character. And soon people were saving and collecting the calligraphy written by talented people. Since these early times, unlike in Western culture, calligraphy has been so highly regarded in Chinese culture that it has long been considered the highest art form. Next oh, sorry, this slide. So let's look at this slide here, and I've put on the screen a rubbing or an image of a rubbing of the epitaph of Hu Jiaoyi. So this is an epitaph that dates to the 6th century, the first quarter of the 6th century in China. It's the kind of thing that would have been placed within a tomb, usually near the entrance to the tomb, inside the tomb, or within the chamber of the tomb itself. And it's in a form of script that is a kind of standard script. It's very, very close, even at this point, to the kind of standard script that you would see, for example, if you were to read a Chinese newspaper that was printed in Taiwan or in Singapore, for example. And the content of this actually relates, it's actually a woman that it's talking about, an important concubine, but the details are not really important here. What in fact is important to us is that that this kind of rubbing of a stone engraving, these were used to disseminate different types of calligraphy, and were used as models for calligraphers to practice different styles of writing. And you can see that in this style, each character is kind of formed within its own little square, contained with its own little square, and each line of each character is really, really clear. Next slide, please. I'm turning now to another piece. This is by a calligrapher whose name is Chen Feng, and this is an 18th century piece of calligraphy. And here we're actually looking at ink on paper. Okay, so the basic tools of a Chinese calligraphy are going to be ink, which is made from lamp black and some kind of adhesive, probably from animal skins or bones, and this is water soluble. It's dissolved into the thickness that the calligrapher wants, and then the calligrapher uses a brush, usually on paper, but sometimes also on silk, to write these characters. And I'm just comparing for you here on the right-hand side. I've picked a really simple character, the character Shan for mountain in Chinese, that comes from that epitaph. And then I've also picked a detail out from this calligraphic piece by Chen Feng, which is in a style of script called running script or semi-cursive. And you can see that the calligrapher in this semi-cursive style is being much less careful about the way he picks up his brush between all the strokes. So it becomes cursive in the way in English, if you write in cursive, you kind of reduce the number of times you're lifting up your pen, and you're making your writing much more cursory, so it's much more difficult to read. In this case, the artist is writing words that Sima Guang, who was an 11th century historian and a conservative politician, had inscribed on the top of a mountain. It can be translated to something like, the secret of mountain climbing is to walk slowly so that you will not tire, and to put down your feet on level spots so that you will not stumble. This one should know. So this is one, along with the standard style that I had shown you before, of many, many different Chinese calligraphic styles. This is a form that's often used for the semi-cursive for handwritten letters, for example. And calligraphy, there's so many styles that it really takes years and years of study, and involves copying examples from the past, as I mentioned before. And a great calligrapher usually absorbs elements from all of this study over the years and ultimately will develop a writing that has a character all of its own. I think Ashley would probably like to talk a little bit about Islamic calligraphy.
Thank you, Ani. And I do hope as we move between the Islamic world and East Asia with these different artworks in the Walters collection, you'll see some of these parallels sort of across the Asian continent. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Here we have a really beautiful page from a fragment of a Quran in our collection from the 9th century. The origins and importance of calligraphy in the Islamic world are really tied up in with the Quran, and gives it its significance. The word of God needed to be written beautifully, so beautiful writing. And here we have, as I said, an example of a Quran from the 9th century, which is quite early. We have a few from this period, and this era of Quran production really is characterized by the format you're looking at right now. So it's this oblong, horizontal, or landscape format page with this really angular, lapidary script in a very dark ink. The script is called Kufic oftentimes, and some of the elements here that you can pick out are these red dots, and these give us the short vowels. But I will say that this script is very difficult to read. Even some native Arabic speakers have trouble reading it because it's so sort of stylized. But within Qurans, and including this one, you have different elements on the page that allow you to navigate the text. So here we have the chapter heading called out in gold. And so that gives you sort of a break in the text. But as Ani was talking about the origins of calligraphy, some of that resonated for me with the origins of the Quran, which began as divine revelations revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. And initially he also wrote down some of the bits and pieces of these revelations on things like bone. And it was decades later that a caliph, or one of the early rulers of the Islamic community, or leaders of the Islamic community, I should say, who decided to really codify the Quran that we know today. And we have many really beautiful copies of the Holy Book of Islam in the Walters collection, and it's a real pleasure to be able to work with them. If we move to the next slide, we can see another devotional text. So this is not a Quran, but this is a page from what is called the Litany of the Sea. So this is a devotional text that is a beautiful example of Islamic calligraphy. It's quite a bit later than the 9th century. I think here we're in the 17th century. And you see the central sort of motif here being framed above and below by calligraphy spelling out the Bismillah, which is a very common phrase in Islamic art and calligraphy. So in the name of God. But if we zoom in on this central part, you can really start to appreciate the detail of it. Thank you. And here we have, I mean, it's really hard to even recognize as script at first glance. It looks like a maze. But this is Arabic calligraphy, highly stylized, practically abstract, but each area in these sort of concentric squares and diamonds are filled with Quranic verses. These are lacking their dots to help readers by and large, or only where they're able to sort of be fit in. So this takes a lot of like mathematical precision to really organize script in such a fashion. But it's really mesmerizing if difficult to read. But not all texts are necessarily meant to be read. They can be meditated on and appreciated for their beauty. But these were just a couple examples as we get started here to look at the variety of calligraphy in the Islamic world as well. Next slide.
So next, I would like to ask Dany and Ashley to talk about material objects and the role of calligraphy in changes to them over time. how are material objects used, viewed, and interacted with in the hands of their makers, owners, and collectors over time?
Next slide, please. So a Chinese painting, it's rarely devoid of some kind of text. So this hand scroll painting we see here, it's enriched with writing in the form of inscriptions, colophons, which are written commentary, and seals. So what is a hand scroll format? So what the hand scroll format is, it's referring to a painted image that is attached or mounted to a horizontal paper backing or fabric backing so that it can be rolled up for storage. So to view the painting, one simply unrolls the scroll and experiences the painting from right to left. So in this way, you know, the viewer never really is meant to see the entire image all at once. So the physical act of unrolling the scroll dictates the little by little experience, as if, you know, one is taking an imagined journey through the landscape. Next slide. And so in this painting, the artist indeed takes the viewer on an imaginary journey across an idyllic landscape filled with placid streams, rolling mountains. And essentially, this world was meant to be an escape. And the theme of reclusion, the act of disengaging from the dramas of the human world, this theme was a prevalent one for painters and scholars in 17th century China. And so, you know, the ideal was to escape, you know, to remove yourself from the world, whether actually, you know, going into the mountains or taking an imagined journey through a painted landscape. Next slide. So at the end of the painting's journey, the artist wrote and signed 2 inscriptions, which you see on the upper left-hand corner. So in Chinese hand scroll paintings, inscriptions often come before or it can follow the image. And inscriptions may be poems that enhances the meaning of the image, or as in this case, it's made up of prose. And the 2 inscriptions actually describe the circumstances of the painting's creation. Next slide. Now, following the image are colophons, or written commentary. So this is another common writing element in Chinese paintings. So usually blank space is provided at the end of the scroll, and it is a space for viewers who, upon seeing this painting, they are so moved by the painting that they must profess, you know, their admiration in writing. And so for this painting, we've identified 11 colophons that date to the late 19th and early 20th century. They were written by other painters, collectors, connoisseurs, calligraphers, and they all commented on either the quality and or the significance of the painting. And we also can note that there were certain commentaries that illustrates for us engagement over time, so that, for example, a later commentary would be responding or reacting to something that was written earlier on the scroll. Next slide, please. And finally, all the red markings that we've been seeing throughout the painting are seals. Now, seals were used by painters, calligraphers, scholars, collectors, and even the emperor himself used seals. And so these seals are usually bear the form of the person's name, and it's often carved in an archaic script. Now, most of the painting's identifiable seals belong to individuals who had owned this hand scroll painting during the 19th century. So really, in these ways, the writings that accompany this painting, the inscription, the colophons, and the seals, provide us contextual information, and it also documents the history of this work, giving us a sense of the life of the object, if you will, after it was painted. Next slide.
Actually, I wasn't planning on mentioning this, but you can see on the bottom right of this accordion album, which I'll explain, an erased seal. So we also get a lot of seals in Islamic manuscripts in our collection, which is really lovely. But I want to talk about this accordion album also in terms of the life of an object and sort of how it's experienced over time, which is also just sort of one of my favorite ways of looking at art. So here we have an album, the album itself being created in the 18th century, but containing calligraphies collected from the 16th century or made in the 16th century, then collected and collated into this album. And this album is remarkable for a number of reasons. And we can look at some of the different calligraphy pages in the next slide. We have 2 pages of what are called karalama, which is a Turkish word for blackening. And these are pages of pen exercises where the calligrapher would continuously practice letter forms and words over and over and over each other, where the ink is almost then literally blackening out the page. But even though these are still practice pages, they were collected and later illuminated on the edge. You can see on the inner part of the frame a little bit of gold, sort of floral motifs. So they were still collected as works of art. And you see also, I'll have to call out the really beautiful marbled papers. These are 18th century papers framing each 16th century calligraphy. Next slide. The rest of the pages in this album are these short calligraphies known as kata. So they're a format that's pretty standardized where you have 2 different scripts. But this one bears the signature of its maker, Sheikh Hamdullah, who was known as the father of Ottoman calligraphy. I mean, there's so many stories and fables about how incredible he was as an artist and revolutionary in the field, that he mastered all of the known scripts at the time and then created new ones. So to have his signature on a piece is really remarkable, but also there are further connections still to Baltimore and the region we live in. So calligraphers, much as we've already been talking about in the East Asian context, calligraphers train over quite a long time, and they look to previous masters' calligraphy to learn. And it's a lot of repetition and practice to really master the art. It takes many years. But while Sheikh Hamdullah is the father of Ottoman calligraphy, we have his sort of artistic descendants, as it were, living in this area in the mid-Atlantic region between DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Muhammad Zakaria and all of his students living in this region and working, and even he works with students internationally as well, continue working in this calligraphic tradition. So it's a really beautiful sort of ties it all together, the fact that it's located in our region and almost right in our own backyard, that this tradition still continues today, which I really love. Next slide.
Wonderful. So now another important facet of calligraphy in these cultures is the relationship between word and image. And so for this section, Ani and Ashley will discuss the various ways in which words in the form of calligraphy interact with images and to tell a multiplicity of stories.
Next slide, please. So now let's turn to another image, and this image is a Japanese one. And I'll note here that although the Japanese eventually developed their own writing systems called hiragana and katakana, this particular example is written in Chinese characters, and the Japanese still continue to use Chinese characters to this day as well. You may have heard the name Katsushika Hokusai before. He's a famous Japanese printmaker. And this particular piece, an Edo period piece, is a sheet with a printed pattern on it. And it's a fun printed pattern. The title of the piece is Shiba Onko Breaks a Jar to Free a Friend. And coincidentally, it turns out that Shiba Onko is actually the Japanese pronunciation of the same politician, statesman that we were talking about just a little earlier from the 11th century in China, Sima Guang. And this story is, that's being illustrated here, is related to his childhood, and it says, or it tells us that he was playing with his friends next to this big fish container, watching the fish in the jar, and it was a huge container. One of his friends peered in and bent over too far, and he fell in. All of Sima Guang's other friends ran away in fear, and only Sima Guang stayed and tried to help his friend. And the way he was able to help his friend was by smashing the bottom of the jar with a rock. And you can see the illustration that his friend is actually pouring out of the broken bottom of the jar. So it's a really charming image. And it's been placed on the sheet in such a way so that the print, color of the print is very light. And also there are large amounts of negative space that don't have any image on them at all. And the tradition of, so it's clearly meant, it was meant as a piece, an illustration that could serve as part of writing paper. And we believe that the printmaker, the artist himself, has brushed the calligraphy that's written on top of this. This is a couplet of 2 sets of poems, each of 10 characters that relate to themes of fame and immortality, which are directly on top of there. And he's written in this same semi-cursive style that I was discussing earlier as well. You can see that beautiful fluidity of the brush. So we've got his handwriting on top of a print that he designed, it would seem. So it's a wonderful play between word and image, and especially in Japanese art, there's a real affinity for combining decorative papers and writing, and enjoying that play between the image underneath the writing and the writing itself.
So I think if we move to the next slide, we might look at another engagement of word and image, but in Persian manuscript. So in the Islamic world, not all writing and not all Islamic manuscripts are strictly religious or devotional. There's also an extraordinarily rich tradition of literature, poetry, scientific works, every genre you can think of. And here we have an epic poem called the Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings. And this is the Persian Book of Kings, telling sort of the origins of civilization up through into sort of ancient Iran. We know that even if you can't read the language, and again, the language is Persian, the Arabic script or the Arabic alphabet is used to write other languages, including Persian here. But even if you can't read it, you can sort of recognize that poetic structure because of the columns that the text is organized in. That's sort of pairing up these couplets so that you can see the structure of the text, even if you can't read it. The image here on the left is the first in this copy of the Shahnameh in the Walters collection. And you'll see that the text is also embedded in the frame that contains the picture. But of course, the picture then also is bursting out from that frame. So you have a really dynamic composition happening here between word and image. Next slide, please. Looking at a detail of this particular scene, it's just one of my favorites. So this is a depiction of the court of Gayumars. So this is the first man, the first king. This is as society is starting to form in primordial times. And sort of those origins are nodded to by the fact that they're all wearing animal skins. So this is before the manufacture of clothing and tailoring and weaving and all of that. So this is sort of calling to those, the primordial time. Next slide, please. So here's just another opening from that same manuscript that shows a slightly different relationship between the text and image. If you look at the text on the right, we still have those 4 columns where the couplets are organized, but they're organized slightly differently, where they're spaced out. And this allows for just the right couplet to land next to and then be embedded in the image. So because the script reads from right to left, the page on the right precedes the one on the left, and the spacing out of the text then allows for just the right couplets to be associated with the image. It also helps the reader slow down a bit so that they can then encounter this really visually intense, detailed image and be able to enjoy it a little bit more. Next slide, please.
Ashley and Dany, how ubiquitous is calligraphy in East Asian and Islamic cultures? Where can we find it other than on paper, parchment, or silk?
Next slide. So calligraphy, I mean, ubiquitous is maybe even an understatement in the Islamic world, I think. Calligraphy is on anything and everything. And I'm just bringing in here an example, again, from the Ottoman Empire. You may notice my preference for the Ottoman Empire here. But we have a ceramic mosque lamp. And this would have been suspended by the small handles on the outside of the vessel, to be suspended from the ceiling in a mosque. It would have provided actual lighting, but the calligraphy also adds another component that adds another layer of sort of divine presence. Because lamps, not only literally lighting an interior space, mosque lamps are meant to sort of bring to mind and bring into the space sort of divine light. But when a lamp is then bedecked with calligraphy, that still adds a sort of further presence of the divine, because here we have the name of God, Allah, and Muhammad sort of on the lower body of the vessel, and around the rest of it we have the names of the first 4 caliphs or leaders of the Islamic community after Muhammad. So as I say, all of these things sort of come together in the form of an object that would have been used, but also had a lot of sort of symbolic, almost representational power to it and meaning. Next slide.
So I want to second Ashley's exclamation that in East Asian cultures, yes, you can find writing on any surface. You know, not only do we have calligraphy as its own art form, but you see calligraphy on paintings, of course, on ceramics such as this, on architectural signs. And if you ask Ani, she can also tell you about writing on the face of a cliff as well. And so for this presentation, I wanted to call out this ceramic example. It's a Japanese vase made by Miyagawa Kozan. And so this vase is remarkable in a number of ways. It suggests an ancient Japanese story through image, through text, and also through text acting as an image. And so what we see is a branch of a blossoming plum tree, and the branch is vividly decorated in rich underglaze blue, while the plum blossoms are white with the yellow centers. So floating above this painted image are calligraphy characters in both hiragana and kanji, as Anya had mentioned, floating above the plum branch. And the calligraphy, the text, is actually an extract from a poem. Next slide. So you can see the poem is written all around the vase, and it recounts a story that takes place over 1,000 years ago in Japan. So the story goes that around the year 950, a plum tree in the emperor's gardens began to wither. So he commanded that another tree be selected to replace it. The chosen plum tree happened to be growing in the garden of a celebrated poet. The poet's daughter Ki no Naishi, she addressed this poem anonymously to the emperor, expressing her sadness at the tree's removal. So the poem goes, since my lord commands, what can I do but obey? But the nightingales, when they ask about their nests, whatever can I tell them? So poignant were her words that they moved the emperor to take back his command, and the tree remained in the poet's garden. Next slide. And so for the design of this vase, the artist channels that poetic cleverness with his own weaving of word, image, and symbolism. So on the detail on the right, you see the character for nightingale, uguisu. It's written in kanji, and the character, the word itself, is perched upon the main branch of the painted plum tree. So, with one glance at this vase, we can understand a flurry of associations. We can understand a woman's love for a beautiful plum tree. We can understand the nightingale's sadness over its lost home, but we can also understand the happy ending of this ancient story. Next slide.
So thank you, everyone. I just wanted to say that we really only have scratched the surface of the wonderful depths of the Walters collection, especially of Islamic and East Asian calligraphy. I think we'll move now to the Q&A section that Allison can help us with.
Okay, we had lots of people tuning in and some great questions. Our first question is from Judy Fairs, who says, in Japan, I was told that really only women wrote in cursive, but this particular piece was written by a man. This is, I think, in reference to a work that you were talking about, Ani. Is China different as far as, I think she means China different as far as women writing in cursive?
It is true that in Japan during the Heian period, that women were the ones who were instrumental in developing the calligraphic style or the calligraphy that was written in Japanese, in hiragana. So they were the ones who were essentially the inventors of that particular art form. But men also wrote in using that same writing system, and men also prior to that time and also throughout history have written using Chinese and Chinese characters. So it's a really calligraphy has been popular among both men and women in Japan, and there are famed calligraphers, male and female both.
That's super interesting. We have a comment here from Yamchu O that says the Si Ma Guan story is taught in Singapore primary elementary schools, and how lovely it is to see it here in our presentation.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Let's see. We have a question from Monica Smith Rivera that asks, was calligraphy used in school textbooks in Asian or Islamic cultures as societies move towards universal education?
Do you want to start with that, Ashley?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, also sort of where do we draw the line between calligraphy and simply handwriting as such? And I know specifically in madrasa, so schools to learn the Quran, you certainly would have that. But calligraphy, and it depends on the century and the culture within the Islamic world, certainly.
And in East Asian culture, part of the process of learning has involved learning how to use brush and ink to create calligraphy. So essentially, I would say until the advent of computers, and computers kind of taking over the world as a writing system, as a means of writing and printing, a lot of attention was paid to on calligraphy and handwriting, and a kind of fluency in being able to use those tools. Now, obviously, some people had much more given talent than other people, but just as it was the case with our parents or our grandparents, or even some of us perhaps, when we first went to school, we were supposed to work on our penmanship and write well. That's kind of a faded past now, but it was a reality.
And just to make it clear, Chinese characters are still being used in textbooks. They're printed in textbooks and newspapers. And so every child in China certainly has to learn the characters, just like we learn the alphabet here. But calligraphy, yes, the handwritten form, the handwritten practice of writing those characters, it is an art practice for the most part, yes.
And I should maybe add that, some of you may know that in China, mainland China, after communist takeover, they developed a system of simplifying, or they began to systematically simplify Chinese characters. And so the characters that they use day to day now are simplified characters, but that didn't mean that calligraphy and its practice died out at all. People continue to practice calligraphy, and you can use calligraphy to write simplified characters, but calligraphers, tend to write in a number of different styles.
Actually, if I could jump in on that too, I was gonna mention, so in the Ottoman context in particular, with the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the Arabic script was taken out of the culture, was sort of just dropped entirely, and modern Turkish was written in the Latin alphabet, like in much the same way English is today. So the art of calligraphy really did wane quite a bit, which is why it's remarkable that we still have practicing artists in this tradition today, and again, sort of in our own backyard.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I would say, even in our day-to-day lives, we see like a form of calligraphy almost in like hand sign painting or hand lettering that people do in advertisements. I know we have a colleague used to work at the museum that does hand lettering on windows. So she's even writing like backwards to do it. So that I think it's alive in a bunch of different ways. I think we have time for one more question, which is specifically for Ashley. On the litany of C, where does a reader start to read on the diamond-shaped design? And I'm going to try and share that again so people can see that specific piece.
But it actually, this took me quite a long time to decipher myself, and I even had like cliff notes in our files about how to read it. And of course, all of my diagrams of trying to figure this out are in the museum, where I am not currently. But it is sort of, I think it's counterclockwise, if I'm remembering. There is sort of a logic to it, but it took me a bit.
Great, thank you. Well, that's all the time that we have for questions tonight. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us, the three of you for putting together this lovely presentation and sharing information with us about calligraphy, our digital team for helping us online. Without them, we couldn't do this awesome program. And for all of you for joining us tonight. I'd also like to remind you that we have another program this week on Thursday. We'll be speaking with Latoya M. Hobbs, who was a 2020 Sondheim winner. So please join us on Thursday. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison.